on the Indian government's transnational repression here in the US. My name is Morley Music. I am the former Deputy Director of Communications here at the Indian American Muslim Council. And I'm also the author of our report on transnational repression, which aimed to sort of compile existing research and unearth new sort of incidents and tactics that the Indian government has been using basically to try to silence, intimidate, and harass people who, for various reasons, have fallen afoul of the Modi regime. And what I found in compiling the report was that the well-publicized assassination of Hardeep Singh Nijjar in Canada and the attempted assassination of Gurpradwan Singh Panun in New York were really just the tip of the iceberg, and that the Modi-led Indian government actually used a much wider array of tactics to suppress dissidents and religious minorities living abroad. Um, we found, in fact, that at least 9 out of the 11 forms of transnational repression identified by the FBI were deployed here in the US. So this includes online disinformation campaigns, intimidation or threats, harassment, forcing the victim or coercing the victim to return to their country of origin or stay there, threatening or detaining family members, friends in the country of origin, abusive legal practices, assault, and of course, attempted uh, murder. Um, so the first tactic that I found really in abundance in my research and interviews with just members of the Indian diaspora was the oftentimes violent harassment of overseas relatives in India, especially in Jammu and Kashmir. This is a huge problem. Sorry, I'm just going to shut my window. There's some loud stuff out there. 1 second. Sorry. Sorry about that, everyone. So this is basically a form of transnational repression where the words or posts or online commentary or any kind of action taken by someone living in the US results in a backlash targeting relatives living in India. One of the more disturbing cases of this is the Kashmiri photojournalist Masrat Zara. She was a press photographer who covered protests in Jammu and Kashmir. She was charged in 2020 under draconian anti-terrorism law, totally spurious charges. Her citizenship was revoked soon after. But then after she moved abroad, Indian government agents began to repeatedly interrogate her brother and father and eventually to beat them. Um, and this kind of they sort of publicized this incident, and it's really affected her life here in the U.S. This is one of the big lessons of transnational repression is that makes everyone scared here in the U.S. She finds that living here, there's often Indian Americans, Kashmiri Americans are scared of talking to her, that the isolation can impede academic work and free transfer of information, and that, basically Indian Americans often fear so much as clicking like on a public social media post. And it's no wonder why. Another incident involves Sam Khan, who's an American citizen, an actor and an online activist who frequently would post on X critical thoughts about the Modi regime, and who consequently dealt with his parents, who are both in their 80s, getting harassed. And interrogated by in Delhi. His mother had a panic attack. So all of which is just to say that actions taken abroad have a profound consequence here in the United States. Um, Another sort of similar form of transnational repression is the revocation of travel privileges to India, and most prominently the revocation of overseas citizenship cards, or OCI. And this has affected numerous human rights researchers and journalists. Atish Taseer, who's a very well-renowned writer, um, published an article that was critical of the Modi regime in Time in 2021, and very shortly thereafter had his OCI status revoked on totally spurious claims about the origin of his father's birth. Um, Same story, Angad Singh, who is an award-winning documentarian who produced a documentary for Vice magazine called India Burning. Shortly after the release, he arrives in India to see his parents, gets to Delhi airport, he's detained, his passport confiscated, and his OCI status revoked. Same story, Christine Mehta, formerly a researcher at Amnesty International, now an editor at the Boston Globe. Her OCI status was revoked in 2014. She'd been studying deteriorating human rights conditions in Jammu and Kashmir. So preventing that sort of free flow of travel and obviously cutting off people's abilities to see their families, of course, sends a profound chilling effect through communities here in the United States. Um, Another one is just violent threats sent via email or phone calls. Um, Probably the single largest, this happens kind of constantly, but the single largest and most concentrated instance of this was a 2021 academic conference called Dismantling Hindutva, which involved a huge consortium of US universities. And basically, it was as soon as it was publicized, it received just extraordinary backlash from Hindu nationalists in India. Participants in the conference received more than 1 million threats via email, so many at one point that the servers of Drew University crashed just from the volume. And it turned out that the majority of the attacks on the participating academics had been coordinated by Modi's political party, the BJP, and the broad array of Hindu nationalist paramilitary organizations known as the Sangh Parivar. And this just was just thousands of death and rape threats to people living in the US. One of the most underreported sides of the Indian government transnational repression, this just connects to the perniciousness and just sort of scope of the global Hindu nationalist movement, is coordination and political interference via partnerships between Indian consulates that are located in the US, especially in larger cities with Indian populations, and then the domestic counterparts of far-right Hindu nationalist paramilitaries in India. And it's kind of the same suite of tactics that we've been talking about, but this time applied to more political efforts in the US to criticize domestic Indian policy. So, these groups have a lot of power. So in 2021, the Chicago City Council, led by an alderwoman named Maria Hadden, introduced a resolution which would have condemned Hindu nationalist violence, and the Citizenship Amendment Act, which is a law that's been championed and introduced by Modi and the BJP, which could be used to disenfranchise Muslim citizens of India en masse. And then shortly after the resolution was introduced, Amit Kumar, who was then the Consul General of India in Chicago, joined members of the Vishwa Hindu Parishad of America in lobbying against the resolution, and again doing one of these extensive email blasts. So all the city council members of Chicago just received thousands of emails explaining why it was, why this quite innocuous, sort of safe resolution condemning killing of Muslims in India was an affront and an insult and so on. And they lobbied against the resolution, and they won. A bit of context here about the sort of strange bedfellows here. The Vishwa Hindu Parishad of America is the U.S. counterpart to the Vishwa Hindu Parishad in India, which is and they've sent $7 million abroad to support this paramilitary organization, whose members have participated in and coordinated numerous anti-Muslim pogroms. A more recent and especially disturbing incident of collusion between Indian consulates and the VHPA, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad of America, occurred just last year during the New York City annual India Day parade, where the New York Consulate General of India worked with this organization, which is the foreign counterpart of a group that organized mobs to destroy the Babri Masjid in 1992 in an incident that resulted in the killing of thousands of predominantly Muslim Indians. And they promoted through this parade an anti-Muslim hate symbol, what is widely perceived as an anti-Muslim hate symbol, which is the state-sponsored Ram temple, which is built directly over the mosque that was destroyed by Vishwa Hindu Parishad members in 1992. And what I heard over and over in compiling this report is that when you see the Indian consulate, the group that you rely on to process your paperwork, your travel documents, here in the US, clearly taking sides in the question of Hindu nationalism, if you're an Indian Muslim in the US, if you're Sikh, if you're critical of the Modi regime, you just don't feel safe, with an institution that should be neutral. A further form of transnational repression, and I'll probably just talk about one more after this, has been the promotion of extensive disinformation campaigns targeting US organizations and originating from members of the Indian government and from members of the Indian intelligence community. The largest one of these campaigns is an organization called the Disinfo Lab, or Disinfo Lab, which has fabricated these enormous kind of unhinged dossiers alleging that organizations, including the Indian American Muslim Council and Hindus for Human Rights, are agents of the government of Pakistan, or in line with various anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, that they're puppets of George Soros. And they've distributed these massive cooked up dossiers in Congress, and they release them online, and it just results in enormous backlash against human rights orgs in the US. And one member, a person targeted in one of these reports, told me, that whenever they're published, she receives death threats and rape threats, and her daughter is threatened, all of which is just to say that TNR, transnational repression in the US, is a very real threat, we found, and makes people scared for their lives and affects everyone, really, in the Indian American diaspora. So with that, I'll wrap up and pass it on to my co-panelist, Yana from Freedom House. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Marley. My name is Yana Grohovska. I'm the Research Director for Strategy and Design at Freedom House. For people who don't know, Freedom House is an organization based in the United States. We work on promoting democracy and freedom around the world and in the US. We're over 80 years old. We have been working on the issue of transnational repression for about the last 4 years. Our first report came out in early 2021. And broadly, we became interested in this, transnational repression as a set of digital and physical tactics that governments use to reach across borders in order to intimidate, harass, or harm members of their diasporas or exiles. And particularly, it affects journalists, international students, members of ethnic and religious minorities, dissidents, of course, human rights defenders, and former political insiders. We became interested in this because we observed a trend in Central Asia and by Turkey of targeting dissidents and former political activists in neighboring countries. And so we started looking at this phenomenon. And of course, academics had already been working, as is often the case, academics had already observed these patterns and had started working on this. And in fact, there's a very good book by Dana Moss on this issue of transnational repression as actually related to the Arab Spring. So in our work, we track incidents of physical direct transnational repression. So this is things like physical attacks, detentions, unlawful deportations, and also just credible threats where no harm has happened, but police or other security agencies have warned an individual that they may be at risk of harm. And we maintain a database. It covers 10 years. It goes from 2014 to 2024 inclusive. Every year we update it. The database now contains 1,219 incidents of transnational repression perpetrated by 48 governments, which is about a quarter of the world's governments. 48 governments in 103 countries around the world. So truly a global phenomenon. It is very, I would say, most common in what we call authoritarian neighborhoods. So this is sort of, groups in regions, groups of countries and regions where there are a few democracies. And that's for two reasons. One is that when people flee a repressive country because of immigration and asylum and visa laws, they often don't get very far. So people tend to kind of stay in the neighborhood. And they're really vulnerable in that case because those countries tend to cooperate together. And that's often what we see is that there's some cooperation between the perpetrator country and the host government. But that doesn't mean that people who live in democracies like the United States or the United Kingdom or Canada aren't vulnerable to transnational repression. Morley described some of the ways that can happen. And of course, we see really extreme cases like the Najjar assassination, but we also see kind of what we call everyday forms of transnational repression. So that's digital attacks, intimidation of family members, just sort of stalking and smear campaigns. Those are fairly common, even in democracies, unfortunately. India is one of the countries that we have in terms of the perpetrator state. It's not the most ubiquitous. So there's a top 10, and those 10 are actually responsible for about 80% of all the cases we've ever tracked. The top 10 include China, Turkey, Tajikistan, Russia, Turkmenistan, Egypt, Cambodia, Uzbekistan, Iran, and Belarus. All of those countries, we have at least 50 cases that they have that we can establish that they are responsible for. But what makes India unique is that it has targeted, or there are credible sort of allegations that the Indian government has targeted people living in democracies, which is less common, including in Canada and the United States and the United Kingdom. And we, both with physical attacks, but also I think this notion of using access to consular services, using access to passports and visas and other statuses to really deter people from expressing dissent or using their freedom of expression rights, I think is one of the other unique features of the transnational repression perpetrated by the Indian government. Maybe I'll pause there. I'm happy to take questions and engage further in the discussion.
I think we'll do questions after all the panelists, but thanks very much, Yana. Um, Manurmal, do you want to go next?
Sure, thank you. And thank you to IAMC for putting this together. My name is Minermal Gore. I'm the Senior Federal Policy Manager at the Sikh Coalition. By way of background, the Sikh Coalition is the nation's largest Sikh civil rights organization. We were founded in the immediate aftermath of September 11th in response to a torrent of hate crimes and hate violence and bigotry that our community and other communities experienced in the aftermath of September 11th. In the 20 plus years since then, our work has focused on making sure that Sikhs in the US are able to exercise all of their rights and freedoms without having to sacrifice their faith or their articles of faith or experience hate violence. So that includes advocating for the victims of hate violence, um, pursuing cases on behalf of Sikhs who have experienced discrimination in the workplace because of their faith, working on inclusive curriculums in schools to make sure that Sikh students are able to see themselves represented in their learning, and a whole host of other civil rights policy priorities. We have long been aware, even as a domestic civil rights organization, that there are members of our community that have long suspected that the Indian government reaches beyond its own borders to attempt to silence or harass members of the Sikh community and others. All of that came to a head in 2023, as has been mentioned, when the United States Department of Justice unsealed their indictment of an Indian national who they accused of being recruited by an Indian government employee to assassinate a Sikh American in New York City. And this came on the heels of the assassination of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, which has already been mentioned, that happened earlier in 2023. And the Canadian government as well announced that they were investigating credible allegations of the Indian government's involvement in Mr. Nijjar's assassination. And so those events in 2023 kind of triggered transnational repression becoming a significant part of our policy portfolio, even as a domestic civil rights organization. Just as a disclaimer, the Sikh Coalition doesn't take a position on most international issues. That includes the issue of the creation of Khalistan or a separate Sikh state in South Asia. But we do believe that all Sikhs in the US have a right to exercise their free speech, political speech, without being targeted violently or otherwise by our government or by a foreign government. And so that's the principle that's guided our transnational repression work for the past year and a half or so. Um, and so I think what our goals are in doing this work is just making sure that lawmakers, policymakers, decision makers in our government, whether it's members of Congress, the FBI, which is the federal government's agency that's tasked with investigating instances of transnational oppression, the White House, the Department of State, are aware that in addition to, our adversaries that are notorious for committing transnational oppression against US-based persons, the government of India is doing so as well. Our community is very concerned about it. And we expect to see the same kind of accountability measures that we would see from our government in response to transnational oppression committed by our adversaries. We think that's very important. One, just for the safety and well-being of Sikhs, just to make sure that we can be sure that no more Sikhs are going to be assassinated or otherwise violently targeted by a foreign government just for engaging in free speech in the US. And two, just to send a signal not only to the government of India, but to all governments who might be interested in engaging in transnational oppression on our soil, that it's not acceptable and that a favorable strategic or political relationship with the United States will not allow any government to evade accountability for transgressing US sovereignty. So that's a little bit about our work on TNR over the past year and a half or so, and looking forward to talking more about it.
Thank you so much, Manurmal. Atar, are you ready?
Yes. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for the invite and allowing me to talk a little bit about this. So I think most of the foundational work regarding Kashmir has already been done by all of you and especially Morley. I just wanted to point out a few things that I feel just to not point, I think it's already been said, but what I really feel in case of Kashmir also needs to be said more so is this normalization that is happening under the garb of transnational repression and the banality of the transnational repression, not through these spectacular acts of assassinations or things like that, but the daily surveillance that keeps happening. And because in this moment, what we've seen in the last 1 decade, that there is a deep, deep narrative of that Kashmir is normal. Now the autonomy is gone. Now we have development and Kashmiris are happy. So in 2019, we saw this resurgence of re-internationalization of Kashmir issue in the global community, especially here in the US and parts of Europe and UK. And that was 2019, and there was a lot of conversation around Kashmir. There was a lot of conversation around the autonomy being unilaterally, militarily being taken away by India. And slowly and steadily, now we do not hear the voices anymore. And I think that for all of us who are watching Kashmir and Kashmiri diaspora, it should be a moment of sort of reflection as to where are those voices? Why are people so quiet? So it's not that suddenly in the last 5 years that Kashmiris have realized that they have to be normal and they have to be happy and this is their destiny. But the fact is that there is a connection. The transnational repression that happens every day, that happens in silent ways. And Morley, your report and everyone here has talked about how it's digital, how it's the repression of family members back there, how it is taking off the documentation that allows you to move freely across the globe and also exist within India itself when you travel there. So that is something that is happening actively more and more. And the other insidious side of that is that people do not talk about it. The cases that you've already specified here are some of the people, like the tip of the iceberg, who have gone public because they had no other option. But there are people who do not even speak about what happens to them every day, what happens to their families. So that's kind of the other side of it, which really is deeper than the tip of the iceberg that we see. And I think that we, as an international community, keeping an eye on this, we need to keep a watch on that and reiterate that that's happening every day to many people in our circles. So that normalization is something that is also feeding into what India every day talks about as normalization of Kashmir. Everything is normal. And as I said, from 2019 onwards, we also see different kinds of laws inside Kashmir that have been every day. Like it's very hard to keep track of how many laws change every day. And this is unilaterally the BJP nominated person inside Kashmir, not an elected official or anything, who changes these laws. And Kashmiris, they mostly, just like us, they probably need to read it in the newspapers. So what happens within one of the laws that has been changed in 2020, there was a media law that was passed. So not even the media is reporting on these issues inside Kashmir. So slowly and steadily, there is a narrative that's being built. Although the narrative that India has built for the last 77 years, I feel like after April, it's kind of completely been blown out of the water. Now we know what's happening. The international community is connecting the dots. But at the same time, this normalization narrative is also connected to transnational repression because there have been these people asking about what's happening globally, what's happening internationally. But there are very less voices wanting to talk about what's happening inside Kashmir when they know that the repercussions are not only going to be felt back there, but are going to be felt here as well. So that's kind of what I wanted to reiterate, the normalization as this counterinsurgency policy against Kashmiris. And this deep silencing of everyone, even the journalists who are not able to look at the cases. People know them happening in their localities, in their neighborhoods. They know whose documentation has been taken away. And the other end of it is also people not being able to travel outside There are many families, I don't know exact numbers right now because everything is so murky inside, especially when statistics are considered. Many Kashmiri families who have been linked to resistance and sometimes arbitrarily as well. Their passports are taken away. Their kids cannot attend universities if they get into schools outside. So that's also the other side, that the repression, that people, if they want to travel and want to use the international platforms to speak about Kashmir, it's not only a danger to them, it's also a danger to their families, and not just their in immediate families, but their extended families, anyone who can be connected back to them. So that's kind of the ecosystem of extreme surveillance and repression that has been created, and that does travel. And you've already mentioned about the Disinfo Lab, how they have connected people. Like when people read that, it's very amusing to see the linkages that have been created, as if there is like this the fountainhead of Kashmiri terrorism internationally, and then everyone has been given a portfolio. Anyone who has ever spoken about Kashmir almost exists in there, in some sort of a grand scheme, which is not really true. So that's kind of my worry at the other side of it, something that's deeply unspoken, that no one speaks about. It's almost like a deep, and the disappearance of that silence as well, because people are so scared. They might even kind of think about something happening to them, but to think that not just their immediate family, but their extended family, and the kind of persecution that happens is not easy. The persecution is not just maybe dismissal. The persecution isn't only like someone will be detained. The persecution is also demolition of properties. They slap different laws on people which call them terrorists, and suddenly they become killable. They become it's free for all. You can demolish homes, you can put them in jails, you can confiscate their property, and you can appropriate their lands, you can attach their lands to the state, and that's what's happening. And that is so devastating. It's not devastating to just one family, but entire neighborhoods and communities. So and the other end of it, globally, on the global level, or where we are in this moment, in when we see it from here, it's also very difficult to speak for anyone, because you can't even name anyone. And many people are like, you want to speak with someone, you want to do something publicly, but that is also seen as a problem, because that's going to create even a bigger problem. So how does one tackle that? So now in this moment, as after 2019, many people had hoped inside Kashmir that there's going to be a diaspora movement, there's going to be people who will speak for Kashmir. But what we have seen is ebbing of that movement. And that's not because people are okay with what's happened. It's because the silencing, and also not even talking about that, and not just naming, but even overarchingly talking about this issue. So it gets sidelined all the time. So while we know that assassinations and these bigger acts are one part, but this other side is what also feeds into the normalization and silencing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Atar. I think we can move into the audience Q&A now. So please feel free to type up a question for the Q&A. I see we already have one. Maybe you can take this, Manirmal. It's what support does the Sikh community seek from the rest of the diaspora? How can everyone be in solidarity? Do you have any ideas or any specific asks?
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you. I think solidarity, particularly when it comes to transnational repression, is really important. Um, because, I think of one organization that we work with often, Hindus for Human Rights, who is really great on a lot of issues, including transnational repression. It's one thing when a member of Congress office is hearing from the Sikh community that the government of India is engaged in this transnational targeting. It's potentially tied to Hindu nationalist policies that they have domestically. But I think it's really important that these folks are not just hearing that from the Sikh community. Um, And I think that there are messages that our community maybe is a little bit more hesitant to convey, but coming from a broader coalition of the diaspora, I think that those messages are more powerful and have more credence to lawmakers who are hearing about this for the first time and trying to understand whose perspective to believe. I know that when we first started doing this work, one of the first things that we did was work on a sign-on letter about transnational repression. It was two members of Congress just asking them to carefully consider any legislation that comes before them that would address transnational repression and laying out certain general policy asks that we would have for legislation that might be considered. And that was signed by us. It was signed by other members of the South organizations representing other communities in the South Asian diaspora, and also the Asian American Pacific Islander community at large. We had some folks representing, I think, a Japanese American organization that signed on. I think it's so important to have that kind of solidarity. And I think also, beyond formal things like signing on to these letters, being willing to have these conversations in your own community, because I know that as South Asians, we all know folks who are being fed disinformation and are maybe buying into it a little bit. Like even in my own family, I hear folks just like scrolling on Instagram, and I'll hear things that I know are harmful propaganda by the Indian government and its proxies just kind of being fed to them on social media. And I think being willing to talk to folks that we know when we're hearing these kind of propaganda talking points, not just about the Sikh community, but about other South Asian diaspora communities. I think that's really important. Um, and yeah, so I appreciate the question because I don't think that progress can fully be made here without solidarity from a broad coalition of members of the South Asian diaspora.
And just to add on to that quickly, the report includes some pretty specific legislative asks. There are a number of things that Congress can do to at least get the ball rolling on raising awareness and combating transnational repression. One of the first things is implementing the Bipartisan Transnational Repression Reporting Act, which was introduced in 2024, broad coalition. And that would basically just establish an annual process where the US government would sort of collate, publicize, discuss, and strategize around incidents of transnational repression. And just getting that kind of formal recognition could do a lot to set processes in place to address it. We have another question here. This might be your wheelhouse out there. It's Kashmiris are living a specific kind of repression in many different ways, like property destruction. What are some of the strategies that people here who are not so vulnerable can do? Are there ways in which the TNR, in particular for Kashmiris, can be challenged, if not addressed? Thanks for being here and speaking on this issue.
Morley, is it written somewhere so that I could just go over it quickly? I don't think. Or
If you click the Q&A button, you should be able to see it.
okay, I do see it. It's
Mhm.
the anonymous. Okay. Well, what are some of the strategies people here who are not so vulnerable can do? And those would be, I feel like, I don't know who exactly the not vulnerable would be. The diaspora, mostly all of them are vulnerable because they do have connections back home. And there are people who have decided to speak, so that there is also a good group of those people who speak and who still feel that they can kind of, with some privilege and safety of distance, they can speak and they can still remain safe. So what needs to be done is these connections have to be made. And I think Manermal, you already talked about how we have to keep on talking about and also making connections basically as to what's happening to a lot of Indian diaspora, Kashmiri diaspora, of course, but also what's happening to other people who are speaking. So, and there are organizations, also Kashmiri organizations, a couple of them are quite active. Stand with Kashmir is there, that we can kind of like also talk to them, create some networks so that people and organizations that who have decided that they're going to keep on talking, they are able to speak about this, and also make it more easy for people to understand that the silencing in Kashmir is not normalization, is basically the suppressing of dissent in different kinds of ways, and one of them has become this transnational repressive form. And I think people are only now kind of rising to this idea and awakening to this idea that this is really happening, and it's not as if people who are sitting at a distance are not in Kashmir are relatively safe in that sense. Yes, there might be some sense of safety and privilege in distance, but at the same time, a lot of people are living in this limbo. They can't go back home. They can't really talk to their people. They can't really bring people back here because there's so many impediments that government of India has put. So I think in this moment, this is a moment of reflection. And for a lot of Kashmiris, it's also a moment of re-strategizing as to how to do it. So I don't have any ready answers as to what the not so vulnerable people could do. I don't exactly know who those people would be, except maybe thinking about some non-Kashmiri organizations. But yes, in this moment, everyone is being reflective. They're being very strategic because a lot of people don't want to stick their neck out too far, not having the solidarity and not having the support system. So the conversation in this moment is pretty much kind of looking for that kind of solidarity, looking for that kind of support. And I would say there are a few organizations. Stand with Kashmir immediately comes to mind because that's one, but there are several others. There's a law network. There's a academic it's called KSCAN, Kashmiri Scholars Network. So those are the people who are speaking every now and then, and I think collaborations and connections with them so that it becomes more palpable to the international community how this repression is happening, and also the silent spot of this repression where no one is talking. I feel like that's much bigger in the Kashmiri community and for Kashmiri diaspora, and it's becoming bigger because it's so unseen and so disappeared from the public consciousness. So that's I would say that we are in a zone where we're still thinking about how to tackle this, and this is the moment for creating more networks and solidarities, first to speak and then to illustrate and then of course strategize. Thank you.
Thank you. There are a few questions here. One is the Trump admin must be a major setback for all these human rights movements in North America and Canada. For example, the Department of Justice actions against Modi-Adani are on ice for now. What do we do now? Hold our breath for 4 years? Next question, what paths does this report open for us in the diaspora? Do you think there might be ways we can put collective pressure, other ways in which we can challenge TNR? Not so vulnerable could be non-diaspora people. What alliances with such groups? I can take a stab at this. Safa, I wonder if you have any thoughts on these first two questions. Otherwise, I can try commenting, but I think you're more in the thick of it. Oh, maybe Safa is having some technical. Okay, I'll take a stab at it. Thank you also for your questions. Right, this is a very difficult legislative climate. One thing, of course, is that there are local and state initiatives, and you can, you know, pursue similar legislative efforts at the city and state level, and awareness campaigns, and interfaith alliances. You can go and, speak. One thing that IAMC and our allies and News for Human Rights is doing is just constantly connecting with other faith communities to connect struggles. Uh, so that's one thing to do if, it proves to be impossible at the federal level, that there are other levels of government that you can build pressure in. I wonder if anyone else wants to take a stab at that question. Anyone? Manirmal?
Yeah, I think I second all of what you said. I also think that gets to the importance of passing legislation on transnational repression, because something like the Transnational Repression Reporting Act, which you mentioned, Morley, and that's highlighted in the report as well, that would require the administration, regardless of who the administration is, and what their thoughts are on the importance of the US government's relationship with India, it would require them to every year report to Congress on all reported instances of transnational repression, regardless of who the perpetrating country was. It would require that report to contain how our government responded to that report of transnational repression, and also what our government's assessment is of how involved a foreign government was involved in carrying out that transnational repression. And so that's why legislation like that is so important, because it puts a requirement on federal agencies to be doing something about TNR, regardless of who the perpetrator is. And I do think, like in our experience on the Hill, when it comes to transnational repression policy advocacy, there often is bipartisan buy-in for things like the Transnational Repression Reporting Act or other TNR legislation. Because even Republican members of Congress, oftentimes they view it as a way to crack down on TNR by Iran or China or more traditional adversaries that they are very interested in cracking down on. And so I think that that's another avenue as well.
Thank you. Yana, I saw you posted a response. Would you like to comment on that a little bit, or?
Yeah, sure. So I guess in terms of like things that are happening, a lot of things are happening on transnational repression. So the G7 yesterday issued a leaders statement on transnational repression, laying out a plan of action that those leaders will take forward. And I'm sure folks know, but the United States is part of the G7. So this year, the G7 presidency was Canada, which will shift in the next year. But there's a plan of action there that's quite promising, which includes actually agreement to use the rapid response mechanism, which is part of the G7, to report out incidents of transnational repression. And there's another feature or another goal set out that there will be support for communities and individuals targeted by transnational repression. And there's also specific attention to digital harassment and plans to work on that. There is a hearing next week at the Tom Lantis Human Rights Commission on transnational repression. It's the second one there was one in February of last year. The FBI has a website on transnational repression and a reporting hotline that you can use. It actually describes what transnational repression is. There are these threat leaflets in all different languages, which are quite accessible. The European Parliament is issuing 2 reports this summer and fall on transnational repression, specifically targeting human rights defenders and others in Europe. And the United Kingdom has a commission by the Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights that is examining transnational repression in the country. So all that to say that I think over the last like 5 or 6 years, this issue has really gained traction. A lot of that was thanks to the previous administration, Biden's administration, which really took up the issue. But I think that the kind of policy ball has started rolling, and I don't actually think that is going to change very much, regardless of what government is in power in any particular country. We've seen governments change now in the US. We've had elections in Canada and the United Kingdom, and I think this issue is still a priority. On the issue of legislation, so in general, I think codifying a definition of transnational repression, which actually doesn't exist in the United States. So there's no codified definition, like official government-wide definition of transnational repression. That I think is super important. I think other forms of or other kind of legislative efforts on transnational repression have to be really examined case by case. There are already reporting mechanisms. So the TRAP Act has been, has existed now for a few years. It mandates reporting by the Justice Department on things like Interpol abuse. I think sometimes there's limited utility. Like the things that actually help are having a definition, having law enforcement trained on the issue, having publicly available information on transnational repression so that people can report it. And then on the foreign policy space, seeking accountability for acts of transnational repression. And some of that has happened through sanctions and visa restrictions and other things like that. Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of give an overview of some of the different government policy responses that I've seen across governments.
Just to follow up on that, Yana, I wonder, just in your experience working on the issue, I'm not too familiar with the legislative space, but I would, my intuition would be that the sort of, what TNR gets covered would be highly subject to geopolitical alliances and who happens to be, allied or not with the US at the time. But I don't know if that intuition is correct. And I was just wondering if you could comment on how much sort of geopolitics affects kind of interest and the capability of kind of executing on, TNR promises.
I think geopolitical and trade factors come into it when you're talking about foreign policy responses. I think that's certainly part of it. Although, I'll be frank, the countries that have been sanctioned for TNR related episodes have been both adversaries and allies. So I'm not sure it cuts cleanly that way. On the domestic front, I don't think it matters quite as much, to be totally honest with you. Like we've seen indictments come down for again, people who are connected to governments that are allies and that are adversaries. So I think that doesn't change as much, and a lot of those things are because it's agencies like the FBI or the DOJ that are actually acting on that, and they're obviously less impacted by sort of geopolitical considerations. But in the past, I think, yeah, and probably going forward, governments that are partners or that are especially security partners tend to be far less criticized for transnational repression than governments do the kind of typical adversaries, like Iran or China or Russia, which are often highlighted as perpetrators of transnational repression.
Thank you, Yana. I think we'll wrap up shortly. Just to briefly address some of the last Q&A things, I'll just say that the Indian American Muslim Council, and I think everyone present here, takes persecution abroad seriously, regardless of the faith of the people being targeted. And this report, focuses on the impact of that violence in the US. With that being said, does anyone have any closing remarks here just in these last 2 or 3 minutes? If not, I think we can wrap up. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much to all of our audience and all of our wonderful panelists for their insights and their questions. The Indian American Muslim Council website has a link to the recently released report, and I encourage you to peruse it. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us. Okay.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Bye.